Welcome back again. The way people are consuming news is making the newsroom editor around the world to take notice. And many people are adopting and embracing new technology. Videos and audios are coming into force. Uh, Nick talked about podcasts. And we are so lucky to have Anushka Asthana here today. She has been the political editor, both The Guardian and The Observer. But she's currently playing a huge role in transforming Guardian to these new challenges. She's editor of a daily podcast, Today in Focus. She's also co-presenter of Peston program on ITN. I'm very pleased to invite Anushka to talk about her new role. Thank you.
Thanks, Naresh, and thanks for having me. So I just thought, I think kind of my background in journalism gives a bit of a sense of the way in which the media has changed so dramatically in recent years. And then if I just talk a bit about that and then about the podcast and some of the other stuff I do, more traditional stuff I'm doing for the BBC, and what I think that tells us about where and how organisations are adapting. So when I first began on Fleet Street, I worked at The Observer, the Sunday newspaper, and it was a world away from here. I mean, everything was focused towards a once-weekly publication in print. I mean, I remember when they first started talking about web first, and we as journalists were so resistant to this idea. I mean, what is this website, and why do we care about it? You know, in those days, the kind of paper was king. You had to get into the paper for it to be real journalism. And from there, even 8 years later when I moved to the Times, I think that was still a little bit the sentiment, certainly at the Times at the time, that everything was about our newspaper and the newspaper that would come out the next day, and we still weren't really thinking about the website, although by that point, The Guardian had gone through a real revolution and had started to genuinely put the website above what was going on in the papers. I mean, I'll keep going through the story, but just to fast forward to now, if I say to somebody who we're writing about that their piece isn't going to be in the newspaper, but it is going to be on the website, they wouldn't care anymore, because we have so many more readers reading our website every day than pick up the newspaper. In fact, as I'll come to, we have more people listening to our podcast every day than now buy the print edition of the newspaper, which shows you how much things have changed. Actually, I think newspapers were quicker to adapt than broadcasters. I think newspapers saw what was coming down the line, particularly in terms of the internet, a little bit more quickly. Well, broadcasters, and I went on to work at Sky News for some years. I worked for 10 years in the lobby, so covering politics, and part of that was at Sky News. Broadcasters adapted in some ways. There was a period pre-social media where 24-hour news became the new way that politicians would get their stories out quickly. So rather than coming to the newspaper and having to wait with me, for example, until a Sunday to get your story out, you could go to Sky News and you could get your line out within the next hour. But even that then very quickly got trumped by social media. Why do you need to come to me as a journalist to get your line out when you can put your line out on Twitter? And now we've changed again. And the big challenges of now are so different than the ones that we envisaged probably even 10 years ago, because the big challenges now are that young people consume their media in a completely different way to the way that we have traditionally done so. So, I mean, you all know this. People watch Netflix, they download iPlayer, they get podcasts. They don't even need a TV. They can do all of this on the computer. The challenge for broadcasters in particular, but also for an organisation like us at The Guardian, which is both now broadcast and print, is older people don't do that yet. So the traditional news bulletins still get millions and millions and millions of viewers, and many of those viewers don't want the traditional news bulletins to change. So how does the BBC, for example, and you'll presumably hear more about this later, how does the BBC continue to get its major audiences on television, continue to please an older audience, whilst also trying to serve a much younger audience, which is changing the way that it's consuming news? And, you know, I've kind of now ended up as a presenter of a podcast, Today in Focus, and I still do some traditional stuff. So I still work for, as Naresh mentioned, ITV. Every Wednesday night I am on TV with Robert Peston. But I also, on a rolling rota, present Week in Westminster, which is a Radio 4 programme on a Saturday morning. And I find it a really interesting divide because this week I'm presenting Week in Westminster. It's got a very traditional format, very traditional Radio 4 BBC format, and it's got 1 million listeners on a Saturday. And if the BBC suddenly tried to rip up that format, I can imagine the number of complaints that they would get. If the BBC suddenly tried to put sound design on the Week in Westminster, or do kooky new packages that might try and be a bit narrative in the way that we told stories, I don't think a lot of the listeners would be pleased. And yet, for younger people consuming news in a different way, that's what they're getting increasingly used to. So The Guardian launched a daily podcast 18 months ago called Today in Focus. I think it's fair to say that we were inspired by The Daily, which is the New York Times equivalent of this. Inspired because not only does it have 2 million listeners a day, it also makes a huge amount of money for the New York Times. And The Guardian knew that we needed to get into this game and we needed to try and compete. But the listeners that we're attracting listen, audio is borderless. They listen to American podcasts, and American podcasts are completely different to traditional media here in the UK. American podcasts are doing this kind of amazing narrative storytelling, and they are using sound design in an unbelievably rich and kind of beautiful way to tell those stories. And what the New York Times decided to do was to take those very, very modern methods of storytelling and to apply them to daily news. And that's what we're doing at The Guardian. That's what we're offering our listeners. As a result of that, I believe that the vast majority of our listeners are under the age of 35. And they are listening to us, and they're listening to The Daily, and they're listening to Today Explained in America, and they're listening to This American Life, and they might be listening to Beyond Today at the BBC. I think the big challenge for people now, and I should just also add that our listenership is very, very strong, but it's very young. The challenge for an organisation, I think now, especially for an organisation like the BBC, and maybe Chris will tell you more about this, is how do you maintain what your older audience wants and needs to continue having to some extent? How do you maintain that audience that you get at the 6 o'clock and the 10 o'clock bulletins? How do you keep people listening to Radio 4 who have listened to it forever and want it to stay the same, whilst also trying to adapt to attract these new younger audiences who now are just as likely to listen to The Guardian or listen to the New York Times or listen to Vox as they are to turn on Radio 4, and perhaps even more likely in some of those cases. And I think this is a great challenge for the media at the moment, because there are some people in the BBC who I'm sure think, we've got to go the whole hog. We've got to go and attract these audiences. We've got to accept that this is what they're listening to in America. We've just got to keep changing what we do, because they know that those young people are not watching the 10 o'clock news. I mean, the figures are startling between the number of people in their 20s and the number of people in their 60s who sit down at 10 o'clock at night and watch a bulletin. But at the same time, they can't afford, and this is, I know, another view within somewhere like the BBC, they can't afford to suddenly give up all those other audiences and change all these formats and keep going. So what they're trying to do, which is what we're all trying to do, is to offer a mix to people and to keep kind of adapting, to try and to try and win over these new audiences, but doing it in a kind of very slow, step-by-step way that people can then embrace. So if you love The Guardian, you can listen to Today in Focus, but you can still read our traditional news stories on the web. I mean, I do think to some extent print has, this is all on the record, isn't it? So I shouldn't quite say this, but I do think to some extent print is the past. I do think that, you could just look at the figures. In fact, did you share them, Nick? I mean, it's something like, millions and millions and millions and millions of people look at the website every day, and I don't actually even know, is it 100,000? Not much over 100,000 probably buy the newspaper now. But we're still offering them that kind of more traditional news package alongside more innovative digital ideas, alongside a new type of podcast, alongside videos that go up on YouTube. And we are adapting continuously because the challenge is adapting continuously. You know, this is what we think we need to do now. I guess what we're all trying to do is to, in fact, what Matthias was saying just now, like look to the future and think about what we need to be doing in a year's time and how we're going to keep those audiences. And one of the things I'm very interested in is whether this is just so generational. So young people now will continue to want to listen to things and watch things in the way that they watch them now, or whether they will actually become more traditional as they get older. I suspect they won't, actually. I suspect that the kind of ship has sailed, that the way people consume news and consume media has changed, and you can't go back on that. But just a final thought on this before, and then I can take any questions people want. I don't think that means that we dumb down, and I don't think that that means that we... I don't think that that means that we make our formats shorter. I don't think that it has to mean that we are just looking for kind of clickbait. You know, one of the things that's been really interesting this year, for example, at the BBC, is to look at how the strength of a programme like Newsnight remains just as important in this changing landscape as it did before. People might be watching Newsnight in different ways. They might not be sitting down at 10:30 every night and watching it. They might be watching videos made by Katie Razzle or Gabriel Gatehouse on YouTube, which they may not have done before. And I guess the challenge for the BBC is how do you make sure that they know that that's their brand? But that's just as important as it was before. And for us at The Guardian, long reads are just as important as they were before. You know, people thought that this new revolution would mean that people wouldn't read long articles. Some of our most successful articles are the 5,000 word articles that people are reading online and are listening to in podcast form as well. They have been unbelievably successful, our long read podcasts, as has Today in Focus, which again is deep dive. It's not shallow journalism. It's kind of, can we take you much, much deeper into this story? And I guess just a final thought, what's really heartening about that is that young people have a great, great thirst for serious, deep news, and they listen to a podcast like ours. We can see the figures. They don't switch it off after a couple of minutes. They listen to the whole thing, which can be 20, 30 minutes long, and they engage with us about it. So formats are changing, and I just don't think that that means that they need to be weaker or quicker or catch attention in a more buzzy way. Do you want me to take some questions?
Okay, any questions to Anushka first, please? Christian.
Yes, Anushka. Can you tell me that I have been reading Guardian and the Times and the Telegraph for the last 40 years. The change in the ideology of Guardian is still the same. Why can't the Guardian think of a different ideology? Why it should be always to the left?
Well, I mean, first of all, if The Guardian wasn't to the left, there would be no other newspaper in this country that was. So I think in terms of the balance of what we get in this country, thank God we've got The Guardian to some extent. But I you know, being to the left doesn't mean that our news is biased. We approach news in a rigorous and fair way. And actually, if you look at the trust figures, that's why The Guardian has such high levels of trust. We choose news stories that appeal to our audience. And I think actually Brexit and Trump have really helped The Guardian, because The Guardian is a values-driven organisation, and we don't need to be ashamed of that. I mean, this is actually a real challenge for the BBC, because values-driven organisations are now entering the broadcasting game, and they can take positions on things, and they can be spikier about things, and that is difficult. I suspect it means that regulation of broadcasting is going to have to change, because suddenly, why is it that only these organisations are regulated and the other organisations are free to be what they want? But what I think that means is that in a world where Brexit happened and Donald Trump was elected and a lot of liberal people in the West felt politically homeless, they turned to a news organisation which they felt chimed with their values. And that's why, actually, over the past 2 years, The Guardian, through what initially a lot of people saw as begging emails, asking for money, and quite annoying begging emails, has basically revolutionised its funding model and has gone from a position where it was making massive losses to a position where it now breaks even. And, you know, if you're a business person at The Guardian, taking a values-driven position is absolutely core to the business model. And I don't think that for a second that The Guardian would change that. But I don't think we should confuse that with bias. Those are two different things. I think providing content to readers who want to read it is very different to being biased in the way that we report news.
Okay.
Can I have a quick
Vijay.
follow-up to that? I came here as a student in 1962 to read law, and my uncle, who was my mentor, had just done his PhD at LSE, and he said that I've only got to give you 3 pieces of advice. The only newspaper you should read is The Guardian, and there's a Shah's restaurant on Drummond Street, and third, get your digs north of the river. Now, I have been practicing law for many years, and I tell you, The Guardian is still a guide that I follow, and my generation that developed a lot of empathy in the 60s. A lot of revolutionary things happened in the 60s, and they were led by The Guardian. And I still feel, I do not agree with the previous socialist, that you have not changed your ethos. You may not have changed your ethos, but your effect is even greater amongst the younger generation than it is noticed.
Thank you. I mean, it's worth just saying that The Guardian was set up by the Scott Trust. You know, The Guardian is run by the Scott Trust. It's got a very different model to a lot of other newspapers. And it exists too. I mean, the reason it exists is to provide a liberal voice. And a liberal voice, arguably, in a place where liberal voices are increasingly less welcome, and in a world in which liberal views are under attack. And it's really important that we have pluralism, and it's really important that we have newspapers that offer, you know, different sides of arguments, and that there is a room, I think, within our media for everything. I mean, I think one of the things we struggle with, but I actually wonder if coronavirus is going to help this, is we all live in a world where social media has exploded, and a lot of people might get their news from Facebook, for example, and they're not even clear what is a kind of what is fake news and what is real news and what can you trust and what can you not trust. I just think it's quite interesting that when a kind of great common enemy like coronavirus comes along, that suddenly people turn back to the places that they really, really trust. So interestingly, for us at The Guardian, our figures have never been higher than in the middle of a panic like this. And interestingly, for the BBC, suddenly the Prime Minister realises that you can't ignore the national broadcaster at a time of crisis, because people trust the BBC, they turn to it, particularly older people probably who are quite nervous about this, and therefore the government can't play the games that it was playing previously.
Okay. Anyone else? Marcella.
Thank you. Matti, I have a question for you. So we are talking about bias, we are talking about artificial intelligence, and we agree that an algorithm is only as good as data you can feed it. So how do you see Newsroom can fight biased algorithm, or as biased as humans? And how do you actually go about sort of sourcing data that can make good editorial decisions?
Mm-hmm. Well, it mostly, I don't want to oversimplify the issue because it's a complex one, but it starts with awareness, and without that you don't do much. At the same time, with the right awareness, you are halfway along solving the problem, because it's all about just making sure that the data you use, you know where it comes from, you know where it is created. Of course, you cannot go through the data line by line, because otherwise it's kind of pointless that you're trying to use the machine learning models. But the moment you are aware and you think before applying any kind of technology like that, of what would be the worst case scenario that could stem from me using biased data, and if a mistake happens, because it might, how would I proceed to make sure that I act on that mistake swiftly? That's the most part of solving the problem. As we were saying before, like, bias is not a negative word in itself. Bias is something that we all have just by nature. We are biased towards different things, and so the data will always be biased in a certain way. The problem is, what are the consequences? Most of the time, bias in algorithms end up really making damage to specific parts of the population that might have been overlooked in those data themselves, in that data itself, sorry. So I think really it's not as complex the moment that awareness is there. It's not about technological solutions, it's not about workflows, it's really just about making sure that we are aware of what are the risks and we prepare for them.
Any question to Anushka? Because Anushka unfortunately has to go.
Oh, that's all right. I'm okay for a bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you. Suresh.
I heard that Guardian is losing money. Is that right? If it is so, who is financing it, and how long it can go on losing money?
So just to be absolutely clear, I'm very happy to answer the question, but just to be absolutely clear, I don't sort of speak for the Guardian corporately. I'm obviously like a senior member of the team. But I'm happy to answer the question. The Guardian actually broke even this year, and that comes from a position where a few years ago I think it was losing £100 million a year. So it's an extraordinary turnaround. I think the year ahead is looking difficult for everybody, but the aim is to continue over the next few years to be breaking even. We are funded by a trust called the Scott Trust, which was set up under the guise of providing basically a liberal news organisation to the country. The reason for the difficulties that we've had in recent years is that the Guardian embraced the openness of the internet, never put up a paywall, believed very strongly in the freedom of that, and that was a very, very difficult thing to get through. Actually, in part, this is where my slight negative BBC side comes out, but I work with loads of people who used to work at the BBC, so I always get slapped down if I ever say this, but in part because we have a big public broadcaster which is funded by a licence fee and was able to provide a free website that the rest of us in the commercial world were trying to compete with. I believe we've got to a place where we differentiate very, very well against the BBC, so that makes a very, very good difference in terms of the websites. And the model that has brought us to, there's various different things that have happened that have brought us to break even, but one of the big things that has happened was the voluntary donations. I'm sort of speaking over my head here, but I think we now have 1 million people who donate to The Guardian, and a huge number of those donate regularly. Increasingly, people accept the fact that in order to have access to something which is offered not under a paywall, that they ought to contribute to it, and that has been kind of amazing in recent years. But that's where I said before, I think that the world, a world in which liberal values are under attack strangely helps us, because people look to us as a place that they can get their news.
Any other question about the journalism or the artificial intelligence, the issues we are discussing?
Just to our speaker, from your research, do you think that artificial intelligence can reach such a stage that human intelligence has no value?
Short answer is absolutely no. We are in realm of science fiction there. There is research going on at the moment in places like DeepMind, that is Google Findend, or OpenAI in California or Seattle, I don't remember where they're based, where their stated goal is to reach artificial general intelligence. So the idea that machines will be able to do anything that a human brain can do. But at the moment, we're nowhere close to even imagining getting there. So in short, the answer is no. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, who knows? Technology will keep developing at a pace that it's hard to make predictions on it, and it would be unwise to do so as well.
Amish Tripathi.
Thank you. To be fair, I've been in the UK just 3 months, so my question may have more of an India bias. But what one has seen happening is that readers and viewers of media organizations, Twitter accounts, are self-selecting into media groups that feed their bias. It tends to work for the media houses as well, because those that appeal to their base tend to be very profitable. So from what I've seen of 3 months out here, Guardian appeals to a certain base, another newspaper may appeal to a certain base. But if one sees from a broader society as a whole, what's happening is there are these two different sides which are becoming very tribal. And the other side is, there could be reasonable thoughts on the other side as well. They're not being heard. It is not good for society as a whole. But it's actually against the business interests of many of the media houses. It's against the political interests of many political parties, because just appealing to their base works. How do we cross this barrier? Get people from one side to at least hear the reasonable views of the other side, and vice versa. And media can play a big role in this. I don't know what the answer is.
Nick might know this one's better than me. There is obviously a massive risk of having echo chambers because of social media, because of the way that people consume their media. And the one thing I think, and I don't know, you may know this Nick better than me, Facebook obviously continues to be unbelievably powerful. The thing I have felt in recent years is that a social media website like Twitter is actually far less powerful than we thought, and perhaps even far less important than we thought. And I suspect it's had its moment in a way. I think that people did consume their news through it, but if we look at our click-through figures from Twitter, they're actually quite low. That's not really where we get people coming to the website from. And in terms of how can a media organisation kind of fight against it, I think we just have to be a place that provides platforms for people whose views don't chime with others on our platform. Just because we have liberal values overall doesn't mean that everything you should read on The Guardian should be the kind of liberal view of this. I think we have to go out of our way to make sure that we are constantly providing platforms for other voices. And I think that other organisations feel the same way.
Francisco will talk more about the social media and the challenges. Can I have Sarosh wants to ask a question?
No, I just want to congratulate the association for this event. And we are one of the sponsors of this website, so I must come. But I want to mention my book, which I have written, which is The Honor-Bound Adventures of an Indian Lawyer in the English Court. And we happen to be the first English solicitors firm in the city of London. And it has a foreword by Pani Nariman and also Galakia. And I want to give it to you, Mr. Kaushik. And
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I come and give it to you?
Please leave it there, I will take it. Yeah. David wants to ask a question. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, again, my name is Dr. David Dunkley-Jimmer from Cardiff University. I run the Emerging Journalism AI program as part of many other things. Question for Mattia. How important do you think it is for India to have its own equivalent of Weibo, Renren, and Beta? In other words, its own social media platform in the same way that you would have Facebook, Twitter, etc. And what would be the consequence of that?
I honestly do not think I have specific expertise on India to give you an answer that is relevant in any way, so I would rather not speculate on something I'm not familiar with. Sorry.
So the only reason I ask that is there are developments going on at the moment for particular academics and startups within the region to develop their own social media platforms. And that will happen probably in, say, next 3-4 years. And it's something which we're also looking behind the scenes of what the consequences of that might be. Particularly also, same thing happening in Africa as well. But there's an interesting side to that because in the meantime, the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Indias, and whatever there might be, eBays, are making heavily inroads to hoover up data before particular organizations in that region do what they do.
Speaking as an Indian, I would love it if we develop our own data because Western biases are coming into in India. We must develop our own.
Okay, any Nick?
Thanks for Anushka. I'm a big fan of Today in Focus, and I'm very much enjoying the Europe season at the moment this morning. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about, you talked about narrative storytelling, you talked about sound design. I think both of those concepts will seem quite strange to a lot of people. Yeah. Could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by those things when they work really well, but also what application there might be for other kinds of journalism, for thinking about how to really engage people through some of these techniques?
I mean, I actually think I should have said a bit more about this when I spoke, so let me try and do it now. You know, when I began, the kind of journalism we were talking about was the very traditional kind of triangle model of a news story. You put what's most important at the top, next after that, and you should be able to cut your story from the bottom up. I come from a very traditional news background. I've been a deputy news editor, I've been an education correspondent, I spent 10 years being a political correspondent. Of course, we wrote features, but basically it was quite traditional. And then I went on to Sky News and I made packages that were 2 minutes 10 long. And when Kath Viner, who's the editor of The Guardian, asked me if I would present our new podcast, I was thrown into a world that I knew nothing about. I'd done a bit of audio, I did Week in Westminster, but that was it really. And what happened was we brought together a team which married together people like me who were news junkies, who wanted to get the line and get it out as quickly as you can, and people who came from audio documentary backgrounds, so people who made beautiful long-form documentaries for radio. And we used to have a bit of a joke that they would be like the audio purists and we would be like the news junkies, and what we were trying to produce was a product that would appeal to both sides of that would provide all the kind of art form, if you like, of an audio documentary, but on a daily news cycle. And of course, we were not the first people to be doing this. As I've mentioned, the New York Times was already doing it really, really brilliantly, taking the kind of ideas of these kind of documentaries and bringing them into news. And now, what does it mean, narrative storytelling? Because that was one of the first things that I just needed to understand. Narrative storytelling is the reason why you can't dip in and out of Today in Focus, for example, in the way you can dip in and out of Radio 4. We tell you a story from start to end. We decide what the question is we're going to answer, and we try and take you on a journey with us. Weirdly, for an audio background, it's incredibly visual. So, you know, I recently did 2 interviews with survivors from Auschwitz, and the first thing I said to them was, try and think of this like the film of your life. You are trying to take somebody into a place where they can see what you're talking about. So, you know, where on Radio 4 I wouldn't typically be asking people, what did the room look like? How did you feel in the room? Kind of, you know, was there tension? I mean, maybe you would do that. In our format, you would always be asking those questions. You would always want visual description. And the other thing is that you need to complete your story. It's not a chat. We're not having a chat about what's going on here. We're trying to take you on a journey which has a conclusion and in which you've learned something at every step of the way. So it took me, I mean, it's 18 months on and we're just learning every day. But the biggest thing it told me was that there are certain things that are more important than the news. So, for example, we talk about sound design. We've got this incredible sound designer called Axel Cocoutier. When we started, I didn't even know what sound design was. I was like, give him the piece at 5 p.m. and we put it out at 6. Axel takes a whole day to make our pieces sound brilliant. And when I say sound brilliant, they're not only mixed perfectly, he uses music in a way that can transport you when you are listening to a piece in the same way as these American podcasts do. And in the way that I think the BBC Radio 4 format isn't ready for, because too many of the listeners would be like, why is there music on this? And I think it transports people in a way that other things don't. And I think it is an incredibly persuasive and like kind of futuristic, if you like, storytelling technique that is going to take over. I think in the future, young people are going to be listening to this stuff. They're used to listening to it. We have to be able to provide it. That they're getting it in America anyway. And yeah, I think that's the most important thing. So what I've learned is the production process takes longer than you think. That means, yeah, sure, there are some days where we can be very news reactive. On election night, we began the story at 10 p.m, we put out the podcast at 6 a.m, but that took a team of 10 people. And in other occasions, we take 4-5 days. Once we took 4 months over a piece. And I just think, I don't know what you think, Nick, but I feel that this is going to be the future of storytelling.
Future and the past. I mean, you know, a lot of these techniques have been around radio for a long time. I think what's exciting is they're being repackaged, and that privilege of taking people on a journey, an audio journey from start to finish, is really the defining difference, I think.
Yeah.
And as a BBC journalist, I know your podcast can compete with any of our programs. It's really wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Any other question before we move on? Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.